It's Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. Let's start the show with Lewis Tennant. Here we go. Guests and interviews that you're looking for with creators, innovators, and so much more. For all episodes and further info, verbalhighs.com is the place to go.
Welcome to Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs podcast from a very muggy Tamaki Makaurau, that's Auckland, in New Zealand, Southern Hemisphere, the world, the end by Lewis. This is episode 119, my chat with the extraordinarily talented and hardworking Julia deVille. She is a artist / taxidermist / jeweler. The latter, like restaurant, being two words that even me, that sounds a bit pompous, that myself, who is in fact actually a PhD holding doctor, still, it's a crapshoot whether I spell either of those words correctly, restaurant or jeweler. I think the jeweler one comes from the American versus the UK variant of, variant's not a good word these days, is it? Version of said words actually looking like they're pronounced quite different, which leads you to, anyway, this is what happens when I don't plan an intro. It was a lovely chat. I'll get to a few points around that presently, but firstly, the New Zealand Pod Summit is coming together at a rate of knots. Well, it's actually already come together. It's online. It's up there. You can go have a look, nzpodsummit.com. If you are a podcaster or you're thinking about podcasting, or you know someone who's thinking about podcasting or is a podcaster that you think would benefit from a day of a range of podcasters from throughout Aotearoa coming together and speaking to another bunch of podcasters from throughout Aotearoa, go have a look at the lineup that I've put together in the day's event. It's on the 14th of May, which is Saturday. It's in Auckland, of course. It is called the New Zealand Pod Summit. It's the inaugural one. It's the first. And so I think really for it to be a New Zealand podcasting summit, it's got to move year by year, isn't it? So if you maybe couldn't quite make it this year because it's in Auckland and you're very far away, we'll move it further down the island in the year following. It is a annual event, all things going well. I might not even. No, I shouldn't say that. I was going to make a sign of the times, a comment about. No, the event will go ahead. If it did happen to be COVIDed out, then there's plans in place for that as well. Remember the cancellations on the radio when you were younger? New Zealand Podcasting Summit has been postponed due to rain on the fields in Miramar. Cancellation, a list of things that have been cancelled would be quite different these days, wouldn't it? Not much existential to report because there's so much going on that's existentially challenging me and weighing on me at the moment that I don't really feel like converting that into snappy prose for an introduction. Let's just say that I sort of been saying to people, lockdown went really well last year for me relative to the earlier ones, which it did, but just this Omicron thing and the sort of like, well, Julia and I talk about our thoughts and feelings about it in the episode. She's based in Melbourne, so they're kind of out the other end of it, and also she says she lives quite far out of the city, so it doesn't have a lot of people around in terms of maybe that side of the anxiety-inducing part of this whole COVID lark. Yes, as I say, it was a great chat. Julia is extraordinarily talented. I think that the combination of taxidermy jewellery and more broadly it being her art and also her very successful business endeavour as well is, I would wager, especially in these internet times, quite original. Not many people, if any, doing exactly what Julia does. And what she does is, as I say, quite spectacular. You can go to juliadeville.com is a good place to start to look at her artwork and her wares. Beautiful, beautiful jewellery. And so what we did, I sort of think, I listened back obviously, and I often second guess these, but it is a lovely conversation. But I think at the same time, Julia was very giving in that. I think a lot of the stuff I asked was kind of quite 101 stuff that she probably answered a lot of, maybe arguably more so early in her career, but I think for an hour semi-biographical piece, it's quite often good to do a holistic overview rather than getting into the finer points of talking about particularities of her work or particular pieces and so on. Hubie the Judge. Oh, yeah, so juliadeville.com is it's just like the name spelt in the title. Her name, all one word, juliadeville.com. And also a general Google's probably worth a go as well if you are intrigued by what you hear. You can like my show, Verbal Highs Podcast on Facebook, Verbal Highs on Twitter. I also have my own real estate on the internet, although I actually sublease that from Squarespace. It's verbalhighs.com. There's also the New Zealand Podcasting Directory, which I chip away at. Probably need to update it a bit, actually, to be honest. That's at my website, verbalhighs.com. There's a link there, and that's now proudly supported by Free FM. Okay, enjoy, folks.
This is Dr. Janet's Verbal Highs.
Check.
All good.
Yeah, there we go. Cool.
I just thought we were like, this was cursed to like never actually ever happen, and we'd both awkwardly, what's the word? Is skulk a word? Skulk away?
Yeah, I think the skulk isn't that from 4 Weddings and a Funeral or something?
Yeah. So as you'll see this week, thank you, Julia, I'm back in my home environment, which is much more relaxing. I didn't tell you last week I'd caught a Jetstar flight on a whim to Wellington because I thought I'd have a last hurrah pre-Omicron. And they said to the media, they actually released to the media on Tuesday, we are going to start checking everyone for vaccine passes. And then I turned up to a completely packed flight and they didn't check anyone. And then I went and hung out with my 85-year-old nan. So it was quite a stressful day all up, and I was really pissed off with them. The reason I leave with that is I don't talk about the pandemic a lot on the podcast. Obviously, it's come up every now and again, but you guys are kind of at the tail end of Omicron now, right? Or further into it than we are.
Yeah, it's coming down. It's on the way down.
Are you over talking about it, or can you give us some, advice, feelings, feedback?
Well, I kind of live out in the forest, so
Right.
Where I am is definitely different to being in Melbourne. You kind of forget you're in a pandemic out here.
Yeah.
Because you just, there's space and not as many people. But when I go into Melbourne, it feels different. And, a lot of stuff is closed and it's quiet.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I don't watch the news or check in on it anymore because I just found it was just taking over and it just makes you more stressed.
I hear that. Like, I certainly, I'm not completely uninformed. I don't reckon you are either, but I don't get into the minutiae of it. I had a drink with someone in Wellington I hadn't seen for ages who, I didn't say this to him, but it's kind of seems to be occupying pretty much his whole life, what's going to happen next and so on. But yeah, I mean, it must be said, Melbourne's kind of done it hardest, one of the hardest in the world, hasn't it? So even though you're in the bush, it must have been a lot, as they say, getting through a lockdown that long.
Yeah, it's been rough, and I am lucky that I'm out here and my 5K is the forest, but it also, I've got one friend that lives nearby, so I was basically, she was my lifeline, and we were walking once a week, and it would have been pretty rough if I didn't have her out here.
And you get better at it, eh? I got better at it. The first one we had was relatively short, but I just learned a whole lot of things to do and not to do when we went into the longer one Auckland had. Buying a bike was really a godsend because I could get out without a mask on and be safely away from people, Little things like that made a huge difference.
Yeah, I actually found it got harder because when I moved back to Melbourne from New Zealand in March 2020.
Yeah.
With the intention that the reason I decided not to live in New Zealand was I was going to live in Melbourne, work for 2 or 3 months, and then fly home to New Zealand for a month every quarter or so and just have a holiday with my family.
Great.
And then that was the very start of the pandemic and haven't seen my family since.
Oh, no.
But when I basically got stranded here because I came to look for a house and then the pandemic was starting, and I went and stayed with friends out in Jan Juk up the coast. And so it was more social than my normal life because I was living with a family, like with a 5-year-old and my friends that are a couple. So it was very different to a lot of people's lockdown experience. And I was out in Janjuk for all of 2020.
So were you glad in hindsight that you were with a bunch of people rather than being where you were or where you are now on your own?
Yeah. So it was much easier last year when I was there with them. And then this year being, I moved to a new place. It's an hour out of Melbourne that I didn't even know existed before I found this house and knew one person that I met at the start of last year. So it was... which way, like north up towards Sydney or... It's just up in the Dandenong Ranges.
Ah, the Dandenongs.
Yeah, Alinda. So it's beautiful, but it's very remote from someone who always used to live in a city in Melbourne.
Totally, yeah. But I think your priorities, I mean, it's like preaching to the choir, talking to anyone roughly in the ballpark of my age, your priorities change, don't they?
Yeah.
Even though you're significantly younger than me.
No, they have changed a lot in the last 2 or 3 years, let alone decade.
Yeah, and you started talking about that last week during our ill-fated me trying to record in a hotel version of this chat. So I want to get into it more later, like because what happened with you moving here and then obviously the pandemic hitting. But just for now, because I know a few people who are like particularly, it was just bad luck timing-wise with doing things like that on that cusp. I know another guy who'd packed his whole life up. He'd been a resident of London all his life. He'd been a touring artist here and decided he was finally going to bring his wife and his new baby out here pretty much the day. So he finally got all his stuff back in a container, I think, about 3 years later recently. So as I say, we'll talk about it later on. But have you been in that situation where pretty much your whole life's been shipped over to New Zealand and you've been in Melbourne or...
Yeah, so I shipped all of my stuff to New Zealand and then, moved to New Zealand. That was September 2019, I think. And, then start of 2020 realised running my business from another country was impossible. Like I was commuting back and forth, which wouldn't have even been possible once the pandemic happened. And then, decided to move back. So shipped all of my stuff. I hadn't even unpacked my stuff. It was still at the transportation companies storage facility and so then I had to ship it, so I literally sent a 40-foot container of all of my stuff on an expensive holiday to New Zealand. And now I'm thinking about moving back again, so it's kind of like I had to laugh. I just was chatting with a buddy on Facebook and I said I have to go. I'm talking to someone who's a taxidermist and an artist, and I know there's more to what you do than that, but it's kind of a mic drop of something to tell someone. Like I was thinking, like you must have had some interesting, because like I'm a bit funny about that what do you do question anyway at the best of times. You must have had some interesting encounters over the years. It's definitely something I don't drop if I don't feel like having a conversation. I'll normally default to jeweler if I'm not in the mood, and if it's at like a dinner party and it's a bit awkward and the conversation isn't going well, then it's probably a good thing to bring in, because it definitely brings some questions forth. What did you want to be when you grew up? It's that classic thing of when you're a kid. Did you always have sort of artistic aspirations, or were you the classic, like I want to be a marine biologist or those kind of childhood vocations? No, I wanted to be an Olympic roller skater until I found out that there wasn't roller skating in the Olympics. And then I wanted to be a fashion designer from probably age like 11 or something. And I went to Massey and did a year of fashion in Wellington, and I hated it. And then I moved to Melbourne to be a shoe designer. And same thing, I did a year of that, hated it. So just back up a little. Why did you hate? I mean, that's a very definite word. Why did you hate fashion design? And it was just like, I think I had these ideas of like making stuff like Alexander McQueen and John Galliano, in your first year. Yeah. And then we were making like cotton toiles and sewing zips and stuff that I already knew how to do, and I just found it very uninspiring. And I could see how long it was going to be before I was making anything that I actually liked. Sorry to cut you off. So pre-internet, you already knew. So were you self-taught
just by your own interest before you got there?
Yeah, I think I'd done it in like home economics at primary school, and at high school I did fashion and textiles, and I had my aunt was a seamstress, so she had taught me stuff. So yeah, I was always making my own clothes and everything before that point.
And someone gifted you a sewing machine, I'm guessing, earlier on
I
as
think
well.
Mum just had one, so I just used Mum's sewing machine.
That's when things were built to last. The sewing machine that my mum got for her 21st, she still takes my trousers up on if I take them over. It's the sort of only motherly thing I get my mother to still do is like, can you take my pants up? My little short legs. And then what was the problem with would it be called cobbling? That sounds a bit. What is he call a shoemaking course? Just a shoemaking course?
I just called it shoe school. I don't know if it necessarily had
which is very broad. I mean, are you making like clogs? Are you making like fine Italian?
It was the same problem. Like the course was run by these guys who were ex-factory workers, and it was really shambolic. Like there was no structure to the course. They would be off having smokos all of the time.
So it was kind of a scam of a school.
Well, yeah, I think it was just like maybe a new course at RMIT, and it was all like we were using these really nasty chemicals, and there were signs up everywhere saying ventilators must be worn when using chemicals, and there weren't any for us to use. And I'd often go home like floating 2 feet off the ground from these solvents and stuff. Yeah. And I remember once saying to one of my teachers, "Is this stuff dangerous?" And he was like, "No, it's fine. I've been using it my whole life and I'm okay." And he had to shake so badly he couldn't pick something up.
Like what? Yeah.
Then later, just in like OH&S when I was studying jewellery, we learnt about one of those chemicals, and it was like carcinogenic upon contact with skin. I was like, we were like dipping our hands in it and stuff. So, but that wasn't, for me, it was just the thing that I could see again. Like I was making shoes for my dad and my granddad.
That was kind of the question I started with. Like shoemaking is very broad in terms of what you actually make in a course.
Well, you can, it's the thing, you learn the basics, and I could just see it would be years before I made anything that I liked. And and then it was a 2-year course, and after a year and a half, they put a 2-year break in the course to try and get it sorted because it was such a shambles. So I was kind of like, I'm halfway off finishing this, and they've just put a 2-year break in it, which just seemed bizarre. And so my dad had done some jewellery courses when he was younger, and I just did a couple of short jewellery courses to fill the year. And the first day of the first jewellery course, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I could see that within like a few weeks I could make stuff that I wanted to wear.
Great. And so is your dad had a career in what you'd broadly call the creative realm, or? Well,
he's in property, but he is very creative. Yeah. Like he's a creative
thinker. That's that whole what do you do dilemma of a question. It's like, is it about my vocation? That's very limiting.
Yeah, he definitely, both of my parents really, but he was especially encouraging of my creativity, being someone who was creative himself.
That's great to hear, because that's another chat that's come up often on this show, is like, attitudes to like kids taking on, less than traditional vocations. And I think a lot of the time it's just people worried about their kids like being able to get through life, and So
I went to Queen Margaret College, which as you know is a kind of quite stuffy private girls' school.
Well, I don't know because I didn't go there, but I just know it's a private girls' school. Yeah,
met a few people from there.
Yeah, you guys weren't stuffy.
No, I think that's why we left. Went to Wellington High.
Oh, that's right. You did too after I'd gone. Yeah, that's right. You and Emma.
For our last year.
Oh, I used to hate that. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say hate that. I used to be an eye-opener, all the private school people turning up for 6th and 7th form to school.
Well, the reason I went, and then Emma came with me, was I wanted to do 4 art subjects and then physics and chemistry at Queen Margaret's, and it's way easier to get good marks in the sciences than it is in the arts.
Yeah.
I was good at maths and science, so they wanted me to be doing those subjects, and my dad was like, "Fuck this! I'm gonna." Pull her out and put her in a state school where I could do whatever I wanted.
And I was kidding. Obviously, I didn't hate people. It was actually really interesting. A whole lot of new people would turn up to the school 6th and 7th form. Did you cross paths with the I can't think of a describing word for him. Did you cross paths with Rob McLeod, the long term?
Yeah, he was my painting teacher.
What a force of a man and a teacher.
Oh, he was incredible.
Yeah,
it was like nothing I had some really good art teachers throughout my my primary school and high school education. Yeah. But he was definitely a character.
And he was there, you might already well know this, he was there decades and only retired recently. Like, I think he taught art when, like, my auntie was there. So he must have started very young. You, I realise, got to Melbourne, like, pretty freaking young to be moving. Well, I think all of us were one way or another, but you basically decided to move in your late teens, right?
Yeah, I was 18.
Yeah. And did you leave on your own, or was there a group of you that went?
No, I went on my own. I knew Aaron not that well, but
everyone knew Aaron at that point.
Everyone knew Aaron, and he, that was the only person in Melbourne. Oh, actually, I think the weekend I moved over, Alan Clark was here. Yeah. And he kind of took me to Honky Tonks and introduced me to some people. Yeah. So I kind of like met, but it wasn't really till like Mark and Jade and stuff and you guys all came over that it started to feel like home, I think.
And it sort of all happened. I mean, obviously we all moved over because we knew other people when you were over there, but a little community formed quite quickly. Like, I was coming back. My whole thing was, you wouldn't know this, and someone said to me, you'll never end this plan that you have. I had a return ticket from being in London, and my plan was, Aaron was emailing me saying he was having so much fun in the Melbourne summer, and I was in the disgusting London winter, and I just had a huge New Year's Eve, so couple that together. I was like, I'm going to fly over there, work for a little bit, and then go back to London and finish my 4-year visa. Never happened. I ended up living over in Melbourne for 6 years. But it's that kind of city, right? It's pretty... I mean, I'm not saying that moving somewhere new doesn't come with its challenges, but it's a pretty easy city to get a footing in, right?
Yeah, and it's also just going from Wellington to Melbourne. It's just like Wellington on steroids, really. You know, it's got a similar feel. It's just so much bigger, and there's more going on. So
one of those things you probably might not find harder to answer than me, but you'd have a different answer, because when I go back to Melbourne, I see snapshots, but for someone who's been there pretty much constantly since back then, like, how do you think the city's changed since you've been there?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. It's definitely...
A lot more people, eh? That's what I noticed when I went back.
Yeah, and like I lived in Collingwood for almost 20 years, and when I first moved there, it was,
flies, man.
You know, just... Time
flies, yeah.
It's like half of my life has been in Melbourne now.
Yeah.
But yeah, Collingwood was very kind of rough and lots of junkies, and now it's so gentrified and it's really expensive, and most people are getting pushed out of there. So
even out as far as Brunswick now, it's pretty gentrified, eh? I suppose
Brunswick's
it's only
kind of like the new Collingwood.
Yeah.
And,
so it's only the kind of really outer suburbs that I'm sure, but Melbourne's so huge, like Auckland, I'm sure there's still a lot of like OG Melbourne out there.
Yeah, well, and you know, like when I was living in Collingwood, I thought Clifton Hill was far away. now I'm out in the Dandenong Ranges.
When I was living in Wellington, I thought lots of things were far away that are now very close. And I recently walked from my grandmother's house in Strathmore to the bottom of the middle of the city. And I mean, I know that's not a walk you do every day, but Wellington's freaking tiny, man.
It's very little, yeah.
Yeah. When was the last time you went back?
Well, I actually made it back. We had a really big storm here in June last year, like once in 50-year storm, and there was I had no power for 2 weeks at my place. But I got a text message from the power company saying it was going to be out for another 4 weeks. Yeah. And I was like, I was staying with friends. I was like, I can't stay with my friends for another month. So luckily the bubble was open at that point, so I flew back for a week. Yeah. Well, actually, I flew back on a one-way ticket, and then a few days after getting there, the power came back on. And so then Mum came back with me because she was actually booked to come in at that time as well. So then Mum came over for a week, but that's the only time I've only seen Mum. I haven't seen the rest of my family for 2 years.
It's hard, eh?
Yeah.
Have you got siblings?
And that wasn't Wellington because Mum's in the Hawke's Bay now as well. So,
right. Have you got siblings, or are you an only child?
Yeah, I've got a sister in Auckland.
Right. So you haven't even seen her for ages either.
I've got a niece that I haven't met who's 2 years old now, and a nephew that I haven't seen for 2 years.
And like you've met them on Zoom, but that's not meeting them.
Yeah,
right?
I've met them on Zoom, but I haven't held my niece.
That's hard, man.
She's growing up. Yeah.
I was thinking, because I was down in Wellington visiting my grandmother, who I think 85 or 86, somewhere around there. I think anywhere past 80s, I've sort of lost count. But we're talking about sort of like collectively as a family, what we're going to do kind of when she goes to that next phase where she can't look after herself as much, which got me kind of thinking about how often people don't really talk about that sort of thing properly as a family, and then how kind of people are funny about talking about death being the final part of that conversation in general, right? So this obviously is segueing into talking about your work, but how do you find, as someone who's kind of featured that topic really prominently in your work, it's quite a deep question to jump into, people's general attitudes to death and talking about it?
Yeah, it's a big taboo in our society.
Weird,
it's so weird, and it's like it's just this one thing that I think it came about because healthcare became so much better and everything was cleaner and death wasn't such a big part of life, you're pretty much guaranteed to die at a decent age now. The Victorians still had a pretty healthy attitude towards death. They would do the mortuary photography, and they'd actually take someone when they died and like prop them up and paint eyes on their eyelids and do like one last family photo and all sorts of like creepy stuff like that, and make jewellery out of the hair of a deceased loved one. And I just think from then on, that's when the kind of life expectancy started getting longer. And
so those things were, I assume, like, I think I don't think you said macabre or something like that, but I think it's be more about like preserving any kind of memory of your family, right? Of your family member doing all of that.
And I think it's a really healthy way to grieve, like I know a few people who lost a parent at a young age who weren't allowed to go to the funeral as a kid because they thought it would mess them up, and it's like it's exactly the opposite. They're messed up because they didn't get to go to the funeral and have that closure. And,
but then you can't ever, and I know you know this, like you can't ever judge someone either way on that, at the time.
I know, and it's they're all hard decisions to make. But I was like, again, my parents were probably quite unique in this aspect. But when my grandmother died, when both of my grandmothers died, I was allowed to go and see their dead bodies and touch them. And I just remember one day when I was about 8, Dad taking me for a walk out when we were out in up in the North Island somewhere, and we found this old church and went inside, and it was empty, but there was a coffin with an elderly lady's body in it. And again, Dad encouraged me to touch her face and feel the difference. And
where did the body come from? They must have had
just had a service there, and then everyone's gone to the. That
is a little odd that you guys decided to It's slightly odd, don't you think?
Well, and it's also, I don't think there'd be many parents that would be like,
exactly.
Touch the
dead lady who we just happened to have found in a forest. You will be fine for years to come once you do this.
Well, I think it did give me a very healthy understanding of death, especially with my grandmother's and especially with my mum's mum, because she was such a warm, beautiful, loving person. And then the difference of that to this very cold, rubbery, lifeless body. And I was just like, oh, the body is at a very young age realised that the body is just a vessel and there's something else there, because the stark difference was so much for me even at that age that,
So, I mean, you could tie considerations around spirituality and religion into that, right? So was the decision kind of also in the same breath that there was perhaps no afterlife, or that there was and it had left? Because it could go two ways with encountering a body like that.
My feeling has always been that there is there's more than just this life. I don't know if it's necessarily an afterlife, but I think there is, I feel like there is some continuation or some experience that goes on, whether it's the same experience you had when you were alive or not, I'm not sure, but yeah, it felt like that thing that my grandmother was couldn't just vanish.
Yeah, right. So the question that begs from that is, and this is like not in a teenage girl dressed in black, hanging around looking sulky at a mall, kind of a way. What's the fascination with death in your, or the attachment to, or the narrative of death in your work then?
I guess I've thought about that and been asked about that a lot, and I think it my answer changes over time.
I've asked a cliche question, sorry.
Oh, no, it's more that it's something that I feel like my answer
something
changes
evolves,
as I think about it and reflect on it more, and it was something that I've always just been curious about from a really young age. Like Mum ran into like an old friend who I was friends with her daughter, and we went to kindergarten together, and Mum told her friend what I was doing now, and she said, I remember picking Julia and Emma up from kindy, and in the back of the car Julia just turned to Emma and said, Emma, when you die, are you going to get buried or are you going to get all burned up? And she was just like, that's a really odd question.
But that comes back to that weird, we're taught these cultural taboos early on, right? So what I'm getting at there is how someone reacts to that is really formative in terms of how you how you approach that whole topic for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and I think that
an adult could really mess you up in that moment.
Well, and I think that's why my dad, who's quite eccentric, and he would go scuba diving and he'd bring home crayfish and fish and octopus and stuff, and I would be playing with them, and I remember finding spiders with him, and and Mum was a theatre nurse as well, so for her, death was something she was quite exposed to. She was seeing horrific accidents and seeing people die on a regular basis. So both of my parents were quite open about death, and when I think about it now, it's I think it just wasn't a taboo when I was a child, so I was free to explore it with curiosity, whereas I think a lot of kids are kind of taught to be afraid of it or something at a young age.
So is it something you've come up against, resistance? Have people, because it is a taboo, have you had sort of unfair or untoward reactions? I'm sure you have.
Actually, it's overwhelmingly positive, because I think most people are curious about this. The biggest reactions I've had have been from animal rights people and vegans, which, I find it funny because, I was vegetarian and then vegan, and I'm now no longer either because of health stuff, but I was... At the time of making all of my taxidermy work, I was either vegetarian or vegan, and all of the animals had died of natural causes, and I would get death threats. Yeah,
I noticed that you'd kind of branded, maybe not the right word, but I noticed that you very much have a byline about that, and I guess that was exactly the reason why. That you'd sort of been unfairly pigeonholed. Yeah,
it was almost just it made it easier when you could come back to people. That's not, those things came before the work, but the vegetarianism came long before the work. Yeah. But it was such an interesting experience to be so frightened of, and I'm not saying the whole community is like that, but there is one very vocal arm of the vegan community that is quite hateful and angry, and it's kind of bizarre to be receiving death threats from...
Still, even with all the information you provided them about how your animals are sourced and so on.
Then it starts, the thing is, I think a lot of vegans are actually just deficient in certain things.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this to be facetious or anything, but I had health stuff that came about as a result of being vegan for quite a few years, and I just feel like there's a whole lot of emotional instability that goes on, and there's a lot of anger, and it's anger for anger's sake. It's not, when you get down to it, it's not actually about the cause, it's about venting anger, because no matter what you come back with, it's but the animal died of natural causes. Oh, but you didn't ask its permission.
You're saying
permission.
You're saying a dietary deficiency as well, which is what I joked about, but actually makes sense when you put it like that.
Yeah, if you're missing like B12, like B12 is, I think, part of what you need for the myelin sheath and stuff for the brain to work. Like, there are things that you can do a vegan diet and be healthy, but it takes a lot of work, and there's a lot of vegans who are eating, unhealthy food and just nutritionally deficient.
Well, I don't want to end up getting targeted by these people, but I've got a story for you now. I don't know if you remember Sam Scam, who was part of kind of Lou's circles, worked at Coffee HQ with us.
Yeah.
Vegetarian for years, randomly turned up eating a hamburger one day to work. Happiest I've ever seen him. Looked very healthy following that afterwards. Please don't attack me, Peter. Okay. So death taxidermy. I thought about this as a Venn diagram. So the latter relies on the first. So taxidermy would be the smaller circle in the Venn diagram. This is the only maths I remember from high school.
Yeah.
So it is an acquired taste. What first piqued your interest in? Do you call it an art or a craft?
Can be either.
Yeah.
Really, both.
Yeah.
I found up in Brooklyn,
in Wellington,
in Wellington, in an antique shop, an 8-pointer stag's head when I was 16.
Yeah,
it was like $150.
Like the classic on the wooden mounts above the mantelpiece.
Like you'd have in the hunting lodge kind of thing. And I just thought it was so beautiful, and I saved up from my pizza delivery job.
That's a lot of money back then.
And bought it, and I had it on my wall in my bedroom, and it was, I think I was aware of taxidermy before that, but that's when I realised it was a thing that you could do. Yeah. And as soon as I realised that, I was like, I want to do this, and tried to find a teacher in Wellington, but no one would really take me seriously as a 16-year-old girl. And it wasn't until I moved to Melbourne that I found a retired taxidermist who offered to teach me.
Did you say girl quite pointedly? Think it was kind of gendered as well as the age?
Yeah, well, because taxidermy traditionally is...
It's a dude thing, man.
Is grumpy men, like to stereotype. My teacher, I don't know if he's even still around. It's been probably a decade since I've caught up with him, but he is such a beautiful human. He was this Dutch man with a very kind of kooky Dutch sense of humour, and he was just happy that a kid was interested in his craft. But most of the other taxidermists I've encountered, grumpy men that didn't want anything to do with teaching a young girl.
Well, they say things kind of happen for a reason, right? So it sort of sounds good that none of the first ones took you on. And so, sorry, I missed. Was he? Did you find him in Melbourne or in Wellington?
Yeah. About the same time I started studying jewellery. Yeah, I found him. So, yeah.
And I mean, how long does it take for someone to kind of impart on you all the skills and craft? I'd imagine that, I mean, it's I don't know, I just feel that like initially there'd be some quite poor examples of said work. Like, does it take a while to master?
Well, so the way I would do it is I'd find something and go out to Rudy's workshop, and he'd just take me through it. He'd do one half and I'd do the other half. And so the first pieces I did were all like high quality, but I had him overseeing and helping.
So what's the process? You first have to like, I guess, gut the animal like you would a fish or whatever?
No gutting. You just skin it so the body stays intact and there's no blood or guts. There's a little bit of blood maybe, but it's very clean.
Of course. Yeah, you're only using the exterior.
Yeah, and then you just build a new body based on the body you removed. Put wires through the wings and legs, and this is a very short version of it.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Then they get anchored into the body, and you kind of stitch it back up and pose it.
But then you might be like, oh my God, this is so 101, me asking you this, but I bet a lot of people don't know. Like, what do you stuff a reasonably sized animal with?
It depends. Like, there's lots of different options.
Yeah.
So for a small bird, you can literally just get some, the wooden wool that comes in a wine box.
Right. Yeah.
Bind that up into the shape, or use cotton wool and stuff. For bigger things, you can either carve a body, or I often would make a mold. I'd get the body that I'd removed, freeze it in the position that I wanted it to be in, then make a mold of that, and then pour, expandable foam into the mold. So you've got a
sort of like a polystyrene-y kind of stuff?
Yeah, basically. And then you pull the skin over that. So there's lots of different ways to do it.
Yeah. And with your work, I've noticed that you perform taxidermy on a lot of really small creatures, which I've not really seen a lot before. Is that unusual or particular to you, or do most people work with?
Yeah, if it's something really little like tiny mice and stuff, I actually use a different process of desiccating it.
Yeah.
It's just because it's so fiddly to do something that small, and they always look a bit gammy, but if you desiccate it, you can do a more true-to-life form. And
then I guess, the last thing on the mechanics of it, where do you source animals from?
Well, when I first started, it was just stuff I'd find, Like, if you're looking for that, you'll be surprised how many dead birds and mice are in your neighbourhood.
Yeah, that's right.
And then once I started getting a bit of publicity, I still now, I'm not doing taxidermy at the moment, but I still kind of on a weekly basis get people emailing me wanting to donate all sorts of things. So
just quickly, your focus just on jewellery at the moment?
Yeah, I had a really big show in 2018 that I worked on, from conception to finished outcome was like almost 10 years. And it was, each show I do gets bigger and bigger. And that one was just enormous. And I still don't really feel like I've recovered completely from the burnout.
A few things you've said, I'm guessing, you've had quite a contemplative few years in terms of a bunch of stuff that's happened to you and where things might go next. The other thing I wanted to ask about taxidermy is I sort of know it as it's for biological preservation. It's for specimen preservation and all of that. Is there a kind of history before you of it being an artistic pursuit?
Well, I guess the Victorians probably did it in a somewhat artistic way. They were kooky on all sorts of levels. And then I'm just trying to think, like, there are other artists working in taxidermy, but I'm pretty sure most of them I had started before that. I'm just thinking, Damien Hirst obviously had done his sharks, but they were more in formaldehyde. They weren't necessarily taxidermy, and I think he'd done a bull in formaldehyde as well.
So New Zealand is notoriously awkwardly humble, but it sounds like you've kind of spurred a bunch of people to do this since you started working. Yeah, I think there was a bit of a collective consciousness with it as well, I think there were a few of us that seemed to pop up at the same time. That's
but definitely the jewellery and taxidermy combination.
The internet.
100%.
I was just thinking the internet came on up around this time as well. That's got a part to do with it as well. People seeing what other people are doing and,
Yeah. That's true.
So to the jewellery side, because again, this is what I love chatting to people on these podcasts, because I don't know a lot about the topics often that I'm chatting about. I would imagine that being a jewellery designer and being a jewellery maker are quite different things in terms of even the course you'd enroll to do. So you did a jewellery making course, right, which involved design as well.
Yeah, well, it was a TAFE course, so it was pretty much hands-on, and but I just didn't really feel like I needed the design part because I had the ideas. I just needed to know how to execute them. So it was just a 2-year advanced diploma in jewellery and engineering, and in that 2 years I learned how to do everything I needed to do and was selling jewellery before I finished the course. So
great. And how did the two marry up with each other? Just a natural progression, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, I was just learning them both at the same time, and I was preserving these little mice and stuff. So I would stick diamonds in their eyes and give them silver tails and turn them into brooches, and that got a bit of attention because it was a bit unusual,
but different.
Yeah, but different, and and then it just kind of grew from there. Then I started, I think in 2007, I had my first exhibition where I did an actual piece of taxidermy sculpture that was just, it wasn't a wearable piece. Everything before that had been wearable. And actually, in 2006, I did a piece for the NGV that was an object. so then that just started growing, and then I got more into doing like these larger pieces until it eventually became I've done a baby giraffe and
that's amazing.
Zebras,
yeah, I saw that. Yeah, you touched on something else that often is a thread in my shows, and that's like how people turn creative pursuits into careers as well. So you just mentioned being shown at the National Gallery. Like, arguably, I'd say, well, for me, it would have probably been harder to establish or get a name for myself doing something in Melbourne than Wellington, where I'm from. So here you are in a different city. Like, how do you actually build a groundswell and a following for your work? Do you just start doing small exhibitions? Do you contact media? Like, do people notice your work? Or what was the origin story of that side of it, basically?
It was all so organic. Like, I never really set out.
That's great,
to do
Julia. That's awesome. Yeah.
I think I had. So I graduated from jewellery school and I was working at a jewellery gallery called E.G. Towel, and they let me have an exhibition there. It was like the year that I graduated, and that got a full page write-up in The Age. Yeah. And so that just kind of got things. And then I would get invited to do things. And then with the NGV, that was just a contemporary design award that they had on called the Cicely and Colin Rigg Award. And that year it happened to be in jewellery, and I got shortlisted for that. So there was probably about 20 or 30 Melbourne jewellers that were in that. And from that, David Walsh, who owns Mona, saw one of my works.
Great.
And then when he opened the museum, he wanted to acquire it. In the beginning, I was actually quite difficult about selling my stuff, and I said no. I would always say no.
I was wondering that, what the sort of leaning to the artist side, to the commercial side, that balance and where you sat. So you kind of had to be slightly brought around to that.
Yeah, I had David Walsh's two curators come to my studio wanting to buy this kit and trophy work that I'd done, and I was like, no,
you pulled a brilliant business move. You played hard to get.
Yeah, well, and I just had I was clueless, and they were like, this is a pretty good opportunity.
She's good.
And the same thing happened when I had my first commercial gallery exhibition. The gallery, Sophie Gannon Gallery, agreed to take me on a trial basis under, if it went well, they would then represent me as an artist. And I had my first exhibition, I didn't sell anything, but they had the biggest opening they'd ever had in the history of the gallery. Wow. And she saw, and they had a whole lot of media coverage. So she saw that as a successful show, even though there were no sales. Yeah. But then after the exhibition, from all the press coverage it had, somebody wanted to buy this piece that had been for sale, and I was glad that it didn't sell because I got to keep it. And so she was like, I've got someone who wants to buy this. And I was like, no. She was like, if you want to be an artist, you're going to have to sell some of your work. And I was like, I don't want to sell it. And then eventually I came around. It was a $10,000 sale. It wasn't like a small thing.
I was wondering that, hearing all of this, like, you don't really want to sell your work. You've got a dealer saying, hey, come on. Like, how does a price come from that? Like, how do you even is that the consultation with the dealer who gives you advice? If you're just like, no, I can't put any price on this, I don't want to sell it.
No, it already had a price on it.
Oh, okay. You just didn't want to sell it. You put a price on it, but we're hoping you didn't sell it.
It was like whenever I have an exhibition and something doesn't sell, I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
Then I get to keep, because I get very attached to them.
Yeah, sure.
In the beginning, it was more so. Like, now I've kind of got used to it, and I have a collection of my own work of pieces that I like. But once I kind of crossed that threshold, I was like, okay, I can let these things go. But they just meant so much to me, because I would spend sometimes like months and months solidly working on a piece. So there's, it's.
Well, yeah. I was going to ask that with, obviously not just the time spent with the taxidermy side of things, but how true to the traditions, I guess, of jewellery is the way you make jewellery. Because I'd imagine that, this is a total guess, that there's machinery and so on for faster production these days. Obviously, there's a lot of mass-produced jewellery, but do you very much take that kind of, artisanal approach to making your jewellery from scratch?
In a sense, like when I was making exhibition work and stuff, if I was making a brooch, I would hand make the whole brooch mechanism instead of buying one. Like I would make my own hinge. And if you're wanting to commercially sell things, like brooches, you can't do them like that because you'd be selling a silver brooch for $5,000.
Yep.
But like my rings are all handmade, and I actually make the rings in wax.
Wow.
So I build it in wax, and then it gets cast from that, and then my jeweler cleans up the casting, and then it goes to my stone setter, and he puts the stones. And so there's like a whole lot of the jewellery is very specialised. So you have people you work with, like you have a stone setter, you have an electroplater, you have engravers. So these are things that people train for their whole lifetime to be on just the one skill.
Well, that's another thing I saw with your approach and what you do. And you might say, no, this isn't part of it all at all. But for me, there's a whole importance and also kind of romanticism I see around preserving these trades and these that are thousands of years old. Is that a part of it for you?
Yeah, I really appreciate the idea of handmade. And the craft. And I like, for me, the idea, like, there's nothing worse than a piece of IKEA furniture, basically, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm looking around the room.
Sorry.
Oh, there's none there.
Not to say that I haven't owned it before, but like, you know, you can buy a beautiful piece of like antique walnut furniture for not that much more than what you would buy a piece of IKEA crap for now these days, because people don't value antiques and these beautifully crafted items.
Well, then there's also the whole needlessly buying new things that just end up on landfills when you could buy that table and it gets passed through many people over hundreds of years. So.
And it's that whole idea of wabi-sabi, you know, like the imperfection and the age, I think, is something that I find really beautiful.
Oh, is that like patina? You've gone over my head there.
Yeah, so the wabi-sabi is like, it's a Japanese thing of like, I don't know what it translates to exactly, but it basically means like beauty and the imperfections. And there's even that thing of like Japanese pottery where they smash the pottery and then they glue it back together and put gold leaf through the joins.
Have you been to Japan, Julia?
No, I haven't.
Oh my God!
Actually,
you've got Japan written all over you.
I've been for a day when I was 4.
I went for a work conference and then only a few days, but it was just enough to be there long enough that I was like, this place is amazing. It's upside down land. It's just so great.
Yeah, I would like to go one day when the world opens up again.
Yeah. Do you think we're ever going to travel again?
I think so. I'm looking at going to Peru this year to go to the jungle, but we'll see. I'm worried about, you know, not being able to get back into Australia if something happens, but I feel like it's pretty open now here.
So the people you knew, and because you know, like the Camerons and stuff, they're more in the middle of Melbourne. Like, so did you feel the weight of the pandemic was kind of more on them being in the city than you being where you were?
I think in different
Melbourne
ways.
went a bit nutty, if I would believe the media, for a while, but so it should have. It was bloody nightmare over there for a while.
Yeah, I think everyone, like, we even had an earthquake here in the second half of last year. We don't have earthquakes in Melbourne, and it was quite a big one. And I was just like, that's the pent-up energy of everybody after 300 days in lockdown. It's like the earth is like...
Honestly, I realised I was starting to lose my mind when I was like, hey, this is a bunch of stuff that, like, religious people trying to convert me when I was 12 would tell me was going to happen. Like, plague, you know? Oh, God. But yeah, I mean, you probably know what's going on here, but we're in that weird phase where it's basically like the red light of our traffic light system, where the way I paraphrase it is, okay, there's still some rules, but it's kind of up to you guys now. And there's all this pent up energy one way or the other about, you know, oh, that was a whole lot of bullshit for nothing, where it's actually like, no, it was really well managed, and that's why there hasn't been a lot of illnesses here. But anyway, it's up to you whether you go shopping, whether you go to the gym. So unlike my gym when it was closed, I'm paying my gym subscription at the moment because I want them to stay open, but there's no way I'm going near it. So what I'm kind of getting to is, for me, over the 2 years here, and we've done it nowhere near as tough as you, this has been one of the most anxiety-inducing periods, because it is a bit more like everyone's carving their own road. So I don't know. I'm just going to try and not catch Omicron, whatever people say about it. I'm not really keen on it.
Yeah, I think it's still ideal.
That's a fairly rational thing to think, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to balance out the social isolation with that as well, you know, because I feel like there are health consequences.
Oh yeah, I'm in an apartment on my own. Like I essentially live in a rectangle, you know. It's not great. I hear you. But then it's always like that other side of the fence, whatever idiom you want, like someone in a really busy house with lots of kids is probably like, I'd give anything just to be on my own for a week,
I have friends who've gone nuts because they've had to homeschool and work from home at the same time. It's like, how are you meant to teach, give your kids a school day and do your own job?
Yeah, that's right. So where are you at with we've touched on this a little, had brief dalliances with it, with the living in New Zealand, living in Melbourne. After all of this, are you decided that you're going to stay a Melbourneian?
Only as of the last few weeks, I've decided I do want to move back again. My dad just bought a bit of land in the Wairarapa, and before that I just said to him, could I build a tiny house on your land? And he was like, yeah, of course.
You can build a big house on my land if you want.
Well, I just thought it gives me a base, and then I can sell my place here and just do it as a step-by-step process. Because moving to New Zealand was quite an impulsive thing, like shutting down, moving my showroom out of my warehouse, selling my warehouse.
Can I ask what sparked it? Or is that, yeah.
I just... it's kind of a long story, but I basically decided I was going to sell. I owned a warehouse in Collingwood that I had my studio in, decided I was going to sell that. And then from that, it was like, if I sell this, I'm free. I could go back home. Yeah. And I just really wanted, at that stage, I had a young nephew and I wanted to be there when he was growing up. And
do you think it's fair that, and I've said this to other people, it's like, not that don't get on with your family, and nor do most people I've said this to, but quite broadly speaking, it's just the way we go through life and the phases we go through. Your 20s is kind of like trying to get away from your family and do something on your own, and then as you get older, it becomes more like, shit, I want to be much closer to them than I have been before. I think I'm hearing a lot of that. And
it was like, I'm really close with my family as well.
Yeah, I'm not saying you're not for a second, but that is that kind of journey
it's always been that mum would come over to stay 3 or 4 times a year, dad would come over 2 or 3 times, I'd go back 3 or 4 times, so I was seeing them all so much, and now I've seen mum once in 2 years and no one else.
And the carbon footprint on that.
Yeah, I know.
Right. So the plan is to come on back here. It's great. I mean, it's a big move, Julia. I mean, look, it sounds like you're already coming back and forth a lot. But yeah, even after just 6 or 7 years living there, it took me a while to adjust coming back.
I found it the thing was, it was the biggest stress when I was back last time was commuting to Melbourne once a month. I just wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah, it would take me
a week to prepare for that trip. I'd be in Melbourne for a week, but it would be so rushed I wouldn't get to see any of my friends. And it would take me a week to recover, and then I'd have a week in Wellington working remotely where I was incredibly inefficient. And if I would do it again, I would just be posting stuff back and forth and maybe going back once a quarter.
But you've reminded me, I read somewhere, or maybe you mentioned this to me last week, that this coincides with you're going to scale down the business side of things anyway, right? That's a nice place to be in, that you can do that, by the way.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, well, COVID kind of another of the cliche silver linings, but
go for it. We all need to hear them. It's very, very no, seriously, it's a very collective human experience we've had over the last 2 years.
Yeah. Well, I just realised, at my peak, I had a team of 6 or 7 working for me.
Wow.
And I was just working around the clock, managing staff and making a huge amount of work. And then this happened, and I ended up having to cut my staff hours down. There was someone I was going to be taking on who I just didn't take on. Another staff member moved back to Adelaide. And so it kind of became a fraction of the size, and I was, selling less than probably 50% of what I had been selling previously, and I was making almost the same money. Yeah. And I just realised I'd been working my ass off for a decade to pay wages, and it's a big responsibility, it's
really noble employing a lot of people, but it is, it's a lot of weight on one's shoulders to support them all. What were they doing? Were you like creative director for them, working on your pieces, or was it retail or something?
No, I had a few jewelers, a few sales girls, a manager, studio assistants. It was kind of, it was bookkeeper, quite a big operation. Now I've just got my jeweler who works for me from his own studio, so he just does by the hour, and then I've got one sales girl, and I'm just taking on another.
But you still get hands on and make jewellery as well yourself.
So I make all of the rings by hand myself, and then they get cast in metal, and then the rest of the stuff that doesn't involve like the creative part of it gets done by other people now. Like I used to do everything, but I just do the actual fabrication of the design now. And
there's a lot of terrible jewellery out there, isn't there?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Huge market for it too.
Yeah.
Like I was getting it before, again, it's just totally not my wheelhouse, but I'd imagine that a lot of like your kind of Michael Hurley type stuff is somehow almost factory produced these days, right?
Oh yeah, it's all like all of that stuff is factory produced.
Yeah. So literally robot arms sticking things on,
Oh, but not even like, no, there probably more factories like in China and stuff of just people working at very
absolutely
low rates and just, pumping out. Most of it would be cast and then they're just cleaning up and stuff. But the technology for casting, they're getting now machines that can actually laser print in metal and 3D print in metal. And so there's no sprue or anything that needs to be cleaned up. Like it prints a perfect object. So, that stuff is definitely going to become more and more common.
So that's another strong argument for what I said before, like preserving these, whatever you call them, trades or crafts.
Yeah.
Are you a member of a guild?
I did join the Jewelers Guild when I first became a jeweler, but...
Did you have no, I was going to be silly, don't worry. I was going to ask if you had a funny handshake or something, but anyway, continue.
Oh, no.
I just picture long, druid robes and...
It's not.
Anyway, sorry, go on.
That would have made it more fun, but I ended up leaving because you have to have a guild. You have to have a hallmark registered with the guild, and my hallmark is a skull and crossbones, which they wouldn't accept because you can't use a known, that's the poison symbol. So, so I couldn't use it.
That's the most famous. What do they call them? Memento mori, isn't it?
Yeah. The death's head. And
so they were right. So because you were like biting a well-known symbol. Can you? I mean, just thinking, is that so kind of ubiquitous and in the public domain? I don't think anyone would have rights to the.
Well, no, it wasn't about rights. It was you just couldn't use a stop sign or something as your logo either because it was an existing logo, so it had to be something unique to you. And then I was like, well, I want to use the skull and crossbones, so I'm not going to join the guild. Well, I just left the guild, actually.
Fancy that. Sounds like the sort of place I wouldn't want to be a member of if their rules are that restrictive. A couple more questions. So you still plan to keep on exhibiting work even though you're scaling down the business side of things? Does it interest you to keep getting your work out there in the public when you're back here?
I'm kind of like...
You just want some time off for a little while.
Well, yeah, I never say never, but I do like to say never. I kind of felt like I wasn't ever going to have another exhibition after that last one because it's just I couldn't top that without A, bankrupting myself, and B, killing myself because it was so expensive to produce, and so it took I was in a very serious place health-wise at the end of that. And so I just don't know if I can. And then the idea of doing something on a smaller scale.
Was that because you wanted to do something so spectacular that you put your all in for that? Was it you pushing yourself?
Well, it was more just like every time I do one, I would outdo, I would make it bigger and better than the one before.
Good on you.
Yeah, and then it just got to this point where it was,
not sustainable.
It had like a 3D, I had it 3D scanned, and there's like a VR component, and there were all of these different, I was making holograms, it was just, it was so huge. So I'm just, I'm sure I will exhibit again at some point, but definitely not for a few more years at least.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, you seem to be, even now you're saying you're trying to be less busy and so on. You seem to have a lot of appointments, Julia. And,
Yes. Well, because I've been renovating a house for the last year and I don't work that much at the moment. Good. My work is probably only a day or two a week, but this house,
you're renovating a house, that's work.
It's been a full-time job. Well, it's just
it's really hard work.
I know, I was so naive when I came into this because I'd never done it before, and everyone's like, it takes way longer and costs way more than you think. I'm like, I've already factored that in. I was like, no, I haven't.
So it's a sort of one house on a long country road. Like, I'm guessing where you're living is not built up at all. Like,
no, it is.
It's like you're living.
It's a little township, so it's still it's a touristy area because it's such a beautiful part of Melbourne. So there's lots of Airbnbs and cottages and stuff around, and there's a strip of shops across the road. But the forest is like 2-minute walk from my house. It's on my doorstep.
You bought the worst house on the street, kind of a thing, and now you got to do it on up.
No, I bought a stone cottage, and then I wanted to make it look the way I wanted it to look.
Right,
and
okay.
Again, it's actually, I've been joking that it's my last exhibition because it's basically been as involved or more than doing an exhibition because I'm so fussy about every detail, like it's a big job for me to pick like a lock for the window.
And then you're going to sell it and move back. So, what an achievement!
I wouldn't have done this if I knew I was going to move back. But it's very specific to my taste. Hopefully, someone else has similar taste.
Actually, one thing I neglected to ask you earlier on is in terms of your customers. Is there a core group of buyers, or is there many at this stage?
Yeah, there's kind of all walks of life, especially for my more, wedding and engagement rings. That's a very broad demographic. But the taxidermy sculptures are more big art collectors because the price of those pieces is quite prohibitive for a lot of my other fans. But then I do have a bit of a goth following of quite. What's the word of
grown up versions of those kids in black I talked about smoking cigarettes outside shopping malls.
They're quite obsessive fans, and they're lovely, but they're very there's definitely kind of the cult following, and then there's the people who just want the engagement rings because they like the look of it. So that
sounds like a very, very much not uncommon mix of commerce and art in terms of where you sit.
Yeah.
And I listened. I just knew there's so much there that we wouldn't get into any great depth on any part today. So I wanted to do a kind of an overview. So I haven't seemed like some chump who doesn't kind of know what you're doing overall. But as I say, an hour is not a long time, and I've learnt a lot. And if you do make it back to Auckland, you should look us up.
Yeah, no, I definitely will. Well, I'm hoping to get back this year.
What sort of area of Auckland is your sister in?
Springfield. Is that a place?
I don't even know where that is. All right, okay.
I think maybe that's the street.
I hope she's in Auckland. I hope you've got the right city.
No, she's in Western Springs. I don't know Auckland that well.
No, that sounds right. Lovely to chat. And I think, look, you're probably following it a bit as well. I think New Zealand will be pretty much opened up, they're saying, by October at the very, very, very latest. So we're coming out the worst of it, which is good because I can't take much more of this. Okay. See ya.
Famous last words.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
See ya.